this is really the first time from a U.S. perspective, from a domestic politics perspective, that we're seeing any semblance of brake tapping from the Biden administration on Israel's response since October 7th, since the Hamas terror attack. Up to this point, Biden has basically been full-throated in his support for Israel's response, but it is growing more and more untenable. Yesterday evening, Biden was in Minneapolis for a fundraiser, and Rabbi Jessica Rosenberg, who has done work with the Jewish Voice for Peace group that we've praised so many times on this program, stood up in the middle of his speech and asked Biden to call for a ceasefire. And this takes incredible courage. I'm immensely grateful for all of the advocates with Jewish Voice for Peace and for people like Jessica.
Very fine people on both sides. When I heard that, I knew.
Mr. President, if you care about Jewish people as a rabbi, I need you to call for a ceasefire right now.
A ceasefire and met with boos. I mean, who knows if that's booing, how dare you interrupt our esteemed president?
Yes.
Or if it's necessary, or if the people in that room are really that repugnant. It's hard for me to say, but either way, I mean, kudos to Jessica.
Absolutely. The people in that room were there. That was $1,000 a person fundraiser. So that is the donor class, the Democratic Party, which explains why you see this massive disconnect. They should break down the Democratic coalition by people who can get into that room and people who just have to vote for Democrats because that's the only people labor and social groups can get behind in this country.
Right.
And as we've seen before, if you recall that video from that fundraiser for Massachusetts Governor Maura Healey on Martha's Vineyard when climate protesters were there, these are some of the most odious, vile, militant people against any sort of structural change in this country.
Oh, yeah.
That posture themselves and fashion themselves as good capital D Democrats looking for change, and that these people are putting sand in the spokes, and that how dare they interrupt the president of the United States? They're
for them,
beyond any sort of repudiation I could possibly express.
For them, their association with the Democratic Party is essentially a pin that says, I am a decent person, and I can go to a cocktail party and say I'm against racism as I propagate the mass dehumanization of Palestinian people and seem to think that is in some way in keeping with leftist values in any fashion. Go ahead, Matt.
Well, this is a Jewish Voice for Peace. For people who don't know where they stand, because I think a lot of people are smearing that organization, and a lot of people are joining it because it's fundamentally righteous. But Jewish Voice for Peace is guided by a vision of justice, equality, freedom for all people. We unequivocally oppose Zionism because it is counter to those ideals. Through study and action, through deep relationship with Palestinians fighting for their own liberation, and through our own understanding of Jewish safety and self-determination, we have come to see that Zionism was a false and failed answer to the desperately real question many of our ancestors face of how to protect Jewish lives from murderous anti-Semitism in Europe. While it had many strains historically, the Zionism that took hold and stands today as a settler colonial movement establishing an apartheid state where Jews have more rights than others. Our history teaches us how dangerous this can be. Those people need all the support.
100% accurate. And I mean, this gets lost a little bit as we're counting the bodies in Gaza, and we're up to over 9,000 dead, and that's certainly an undercount, by the way.
And those remaining alive are getting hungrier and thirstier as the minutes tick by.
97% of the population there don't have clean water at this point. Babies drinking brackish water. But I mean, another point that can be made there is, what does this do to the security of Israelis? I mean, there are 9 million Israelis, a country of 9 million people. Does the escalating violence against civilians, dropping bombs on hundreds to kill one Hamas fighter and then openly bragging about it on CNN, what does that do to the population that will remain, if Israel allows any to remain and they're unable to fully annihilate the people in North Gaza. What do you think their reaction is going to be? Do you think that they will just get broken into submission, or do you think that they will harbor incredible anger and rage towards their neighbors that indiscriminately bombed and killed maybe 3 of their children for or something like that? This is what the cycle of violence does. It just creates more insecurity for everybody involved. And the fact is that Israel has much more power, many more resources to continue killing indiscriminately with no clear end in sight. And thankfully, though, after that, after Jessica Rosenberg stood up and said those statements and called for a ceasefire, Biden responded and said that he wants there to be a, quote, pause, which is kind of in keeping with what Bernie Sanders had said a few days ago, calling for a, quote, humanitarian pause on the floor of the Senate. I don't find that to be an acceptable answer, but you can see that that this is clearly being workshopped within the Democratic caucus in conjunction with the White House on the Senate side of things. And of course, the squad has been more explicit in their calls for a ceasefire, but we did finally this morning get one member of the Senate to call for a ceasefire and say the words ceasefire, or at least respond to this question here by Poppy Harlow on CNN and say, I think it is time for a ceasefire. This is Dick Durbin, not on my, to use a stupid Twitter phrase, bingo card for the first Democratic senator to call for a ceasefire before Bernie Sanders, before Elizabeth Warren. Dick Durbin, number 2 senator in the Democratic caucus. This is important.
It's how controlled.
Number two.
It's controlled, but
the majority whip, the chair of the Judiciary Committee. But yeah, I mean, of course, it's definitely controlled. Obviously, he wouldn't go out there and say this without some sort of approval or some sort of go ahead. But at the same time, like you said, before Bernie Sanders, before John Fetterman, obviously.
But Durbin is also from Illinois, and there is a significant Arab population in Illinois. So keep raising your voice. It's making a difference. Even a really, really mainstream Democrat like Dick Durbin, who we've criticized on this program for not going hard enough in his role as the chair of the Judiciary Committee against the corruption of guys like Clarence Thomas, said this on CNN this morning: thank effing God.
I think a lot of people listening to people in power, President, you, Secretary Blinken, calling for a humanitarian pause, are asking themselves, why is that different from a ceasefire? 2 years ago, 2021, during an escalation of violence between Israel and Gaza, you called for a ceasefire and you said you, quote, couldn't disagree more with Netanyahu's policies, quote, when it came to the treatment of Palestinians. Is a ceasefire needed now?
I think it is, at least in the context of both sides agreeing. For example, the release of those who have been kidnapped should be part of this, immediate release. That should be the beginning of it. An effort should be made to engage in conversation between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Let's face it, this has gone on for decades. Whatever the rationale from the beginning, it has now reached an intolerable level. We need to have a resolution in the Middle East that gives some promise for the future.
Have you told the president, the White House, you think it's time for a ceasefire? Because that is a word that the president is intentionally not using.
Well, believe me, what I said earlier about ceasefires under circumstances, for example, the release of those who have been kidnapped as part of it, an indication that this is a good faith effort on the part of the other side. But no, I've not communicated with the White House on that.
Well, they heard you now. Senator Lindsey Graham on CNN this week.
All right, well, we'll play that in a second, but go ahead.
That's what everybody always meant when they said ceasefire.
Yep.
And nobody should pretend otherwise. I get that they have to sort of slow walk this. And look, here's the thing. If ultimately we get a ceasefire, but these people have to call it a humanitarian pause,
sure.
Whatever. But what needs to happen is the violence needs to stop. And honestly, the international community, we're seeing things like saying that they need to come in and help administer Gaza after this. They need to administer this entire one state that is the one state that is in there, which is called Israel. The United Nations gave it to them like 75 years ago, the Western powers, and this project has failed. This exclusive, it's developed exactly the way that people said it might, into this horror. And so the international community needs to come in, and we need to develop a actual, if it wants to be a two-state solution, if it's not going to be a one-state democratic for everyone solution, but that stuff has to be done, and Israel's government can't be trusted to do it.
Yeah, it cannot be. And just, I mean, the growing understanding of the conditions in Gaza prior to this that were underlying it's beginning to permeate. I saw Ta-Nehisi Coates this morning on Democracy Now! Speaking about his experience of going to, I believe he was in the West Bank, and drawing a line to the experiences of the Palestinians who are unable to vote to the experiences of Black Americans when they were disenfranchised. And it underscores how there has been this historic solidarity with Black activists in the United States and with the Palestinian cause. You can look up what Malcolm X had to say about Palestine. And we will get later to the bastardization of Martin Luther King by one Amy Schumer, but that's a bit of a third, fourth order situation here, as we try to open the show with the top line news of this conflict.